Now we'll turn to questions from the subcommittee members. The chair will recognize himself, and let me turn to you, Mr. Cowart, and you, Mr. Greenstein, so that I can ask you a little bit of a question so that you can both get a chance to expand on the impact on consumers. Can you talk a little bit about what happens if we put together a good formula dealing with energy efficiency, recycling revenues, and the cost of inaction? We saw the price of a barrel of oil spike to $147 a barrel last year if we don't put together a plan to break our dependence upon imported oil. Mr. Cowart.
I'll start. My message is plain here, that cost-effective energy efficiency is the cost containment mechanism you're looking for. And I encourage all the subcommittee members to look really carefully at all the mechanisms in this legislation that would promote end-use energy efficiency. And I suspect that Mr. Greenstein and I are going to agree that that is one of the ways to bring prices down across the board for everybody. And secondly, that in particular, we should support targeted low-income energy assistance that would direct cost-effective energy efficiency, particularly to low-income families, through such things as dramatically expanding the weatherization programs. So there are a lot of mechanisms here to help consumers both directly and indirectly by lowering carbon prices and lowering power prices through aggressive energy efficiency actions.
Okay, let me go to you, Mr. Greenstein.
I think things like energy efficiency and consumer relief go hand in hand. The way that we think of and the way we recommend you think of, and I think the way the committee, as I understand it, is thinking of consumer relief, is that the consumer relief be related to some share of the permits. The more effective that efficiency and shifts to alternative forms of, cleaner forms of energy via the price signal are, then the less will be the amount that the allowances sell for, and the smaller will be the hit on consumers' budgets. I don't think this bears one way or another on the form of the consumer relief, but under the proposal that I've suggested with tax credits, payments from Social Security, and veterans, and the debit card mechanism, the amount of the rebate would be tied each year to the price that the allowances were selling for, and thereby to the overall impact on consumers. So the better one, the better the results one gets from investments in efficiency and alternative energy, the less the burden both on the overall economy and on consumers. And if X% of the permits are going for consumer relief, the dollar amount of that relief will be less because the impact on their budgets will be less because the efficiency is working.
Thank you, Mr. Greenstein. Mr. Sturber, in my home state of Massachusetts, there are two large coal-burning power plants, the Salem plant and the Brayton Point plant. Since our state required utilities to spin off these plants as part of its restructuring plan, they are not subject to rate regulation by the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities. If we were to give Dominion Power, which owns Salem, and PGE, which owns Brayton Point, free allocations, what would prevent them from pocketing that financial windfall rather than passing on the savings to the consumer?
Mr. Chairman, the primary benefit that will go to those consumers is the allocation that would be made to the LDC that serves the consumers in that area. The purpose of a small allocation, and we're talking about less than 10% of the total allocations to the electricity sector that would go to coal generators. The purpose of that is to help cover the costs that are not recovered by that coal generator through the price of electricity caused by the imposing of a cap and trade. So it helps cover that small component of cost that is not recovered through the market price. Yes, they will sell it. Yes, that generates revenue to them. What it does do, and let me use Texas where I'm more familiar, Mr. Chairman, because I operate there, is it helps ensure that that coal resource stays viable for a period of time, because the allowances that are allocated to that generator would decline. But it helps ensure that you don't end up causing that unit to be shut down or mothballed and replaced with gas generation.
Okay, let me go to, if I may, Mr. Morgan, do you agree with that?
Well, I agree in part that the benefits to consumers come through the allocation to the LDCs, but I don't see how the consumer gets any benefit from giving free allowances to the generator, because those benefits we have no way to make sure that they get passed along. The company, in fact, wouldn't necessarily even keep that plant operating. If it becomes uneconomic because carbon is being priced, the allowance allocation is based on the baseline, and they would get this perpetual stream of allowances into the future even if the plant has been retired. So there really isn't any incentive for them to even keep the plant running, and there's every opportunity for them to pass along the value of that future allowance stream to the shareholders, and really no way for it to get to the
My time has expired. We have to continue this conversation, I think. My time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, a number of states are actually exceed 90% of their power is produced from coal. And I have always been a supporter of clean coal technology. And Mr. Sturba, you indicated that you thought that there should be free allowances until technology is in place that will actually reduce those emissions. I was a co-sponsor of the voucher bill last year. I hope that we can proceed on it this year. But if it works, and I hope that it does, it's still 8 or 10 years probably away before it's actually in place and you can actually see it begin to be implemented with a number of different facilities around the nation, particularly in the Midwest. So assuming that that's all accurate, you would want a free allocation until that technology is on the shelf ready to use. Is that right?
Yes, sir. In fact, I think that free allocations, in order to help mitigate consumer impact, should last longer than just 8 to 10 years. I think, but they would be declining as the cap declines. So to me, you should be thinking about allocations that would last 20 to 30 years, but it's a declining amount, and that's for the consumer protection purposes.
Yeah. Now, as we talk about consumers getting money back, in essence, a rebate, our state, Michigan, my state, Michigan, we've lost 150,000 jobs in the last number of months. Estimates that were released earlier this week by the University of Michigan show we're going to lose more than 230,000 before the end of the year. We already provide 79 weeks of unemployment benefits, and you might have seen the news this morning that GM is suspected of closing all of their facilities, or virtually all of them, for 9 weeks beginning next month, which will impact even more than what was shown by the U of M. I know that there's a lot of thoughts about rebating consumers. Of the panel here, how many believe that consumers also should be employers eligible for such rebates that you might impose, as Mr. Greenstein indicated, for those? Mr. Sturba, anyone else that believe that employers should be able to receive rebates as well as individuals? Just 2? Can I have a show of hands? 3? Mr. Morgan, you're a no then, is that right? Mr. Greenstein, are you a no?
My sense is the most efficient way to do this is employers will have some increased costs that they'll pass through to consumers. In the system I recommend, this is part of the impact on consumers that would be compensated. Okay.
Mr. English, you indicated that you are looking for an out. Was it 4 million megawatts? Is that what it was?
Well, suggesting that as far as small utilities are concerned, that's what Small Business Administration identifies as a small utility exemption. So, yes, I would suggest that on the renewable electricity standard.
Okay, and what is what is the average renewables now? I support renewables, wind, solar, whole number, hydro. What is the average of your members in terms of membership, in terms of what they now provide for renewables? Or what percentage?
Well, I think it depends on what you define as renewable. That's part of the difficulty we have. Different states have different definitions. What we would include, which would include hydro, is about 11%. And you're talking about roughly, we use about 9% of the power that electric cooperatives use does come from renewable energy that's hydro.
So if you include a broader base, include hydro, include a whole number of waste to energy, do you support the 25 by 25?
Well, I'm a member of the steering committee of the group known as 25 by 25 that has that as an objective, and I think that does come down as to how flexible you're going to be, how inclusive. Let me also add very quickly, there's another problem here, and that is if we're going to produce renewable energy on a large scale, and we would advocate that that's what needs to be done if we're going to meet these standards, that the one thing that you're going to have as a part of this legislation is siting.
Well, that's my last question. I've got 28 seconds. I want to come back to a degree with Mr. Morgan, Mr. Cowart. There is nothing, as I read this bill, as we look at renewables. We've had a problem in California. I support renewables, whether they be off Nantucket or whether they be in Lake Michigan for wind. With that also comes the siting or the connection to the transmission lines. We've seen a pretty vocal struggle in California where the senior senator there has announced that the Mojave Desert should not be a place for solar. We've seen off San Diego, a major solar park being the transmission lines trying to be sued by the Sierra Club. Is there a length of time that the local PUCs should make a decision before FERC comes in with a heavier hand?
I think it's going to have to be very, very short time if, in fact, we're going to meet these objectives. That's the whole point. If you're going to have a carbon cap on it and we're going to rely heavily on renewable energy, we've got to have siting and have it very, very quickly. And I would suggest that that has to be focused primarily on renewable energy on the building of that high-voltage transmission.
Mr. Morgan, you agree?
Yes, if I could add, the amount of time available for commissions to review, first of all, we don't see any evidence that that's a problem right now. There are many other problems associated with siting transmission lines. A lot of the problems, particularly in the West, have been associated with siting lines across federal land. And we do, in fact, have legislation in place now that provides a federal backstop where commissions don't act within a certain amount of time. Our NARUC would prefer to give a chance for this law to work. We don't see any evidence that it's not working. And we are, in fact, open to discussions about further changes in transmission policy, but we would like to see the current law given a chance to work.
Okay. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sturba, Mr. Morgan stated that he's opposed to allowances for merchant generators. I wonder if you would like to explain why you think it's important to allocate credits to merchant generators as called for in the U.S. CAP report.
Yes, sir. Thank you. First, I only believe that it's appropriate to allocate to some merchant generators. In the typical markets in the United States, natural gas sets the market clearing price. So that included in that price will be the cost of allowance for natural gas. Natural gas emits about 50% of the carbon that a coal plant emits. Mm-hmm. So part of that 50% is already being reflected in the price. The only thing we are proposing in this, in this comment I will represent both EEI and US CAP, is the coverage of the other 50% for unregulated coal generation. If we do not maintain for a period of time that level of unregulated coal generation, which represents about 16%, 17% of all generation in the United States, we run the risk of a switch and a rush to gas, which will increase natural gas prices for all consumers. That's a very hidden cost that is real. And we've seen what happens when natural gas prices move from $4, $5, $6 to $14, $15, $16. Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about that clarification, Mr. Morgan?
Well, first of all, having those allowances available, which are based on the baseline, does not provide an incentive to keep that plant running. If the plant is not economic because of pricing carbon, the most efficient thing for the company to do is shut the plant down and keep the allowances, and you'll have the rush to gas anyway. Really what it is just, it's, as I said earlier, it's kind of a golden parachute for these old dirty plants to help cover their obligations to their shareholders. It's not going to keep the plants running. It's not going to help solve that problem.
Mr. Doyle, if I could, and this is a personal statement, as an owner of unregulated coal generation in Texas, if I don't have a plant running, I shouldn't get allowances. I agree with that.
All right. Let me ask you also, Mr. Sturba, the draft text calls for alternative compliance payments to be set at 5 cents per kilowatt hour. How does that affect your membership in the real world? What would the effect of that be?
Well, the effect is to increase cost. I believe that somewhere in the 2.5 cent alternative cost is appropriate. I think 5 cents imposes a heavy burden on consumers. One of the biggest concerns I've got is that we will do the right thing by putting in place carbon legislation, but we do it in a way in which electricity prices increase to a point where we get a consumer backlash. We've seen it happen in California, in the California kerfuffle of 2001. We've seen it happen elsewhere where things happen and consumers respond by saying no more. We need to do this smartly, and if we create systems that cause prices to go up too much too fast, we'll get that consumer backlash.
Mr. Cowart, many of us on the panel here have concerns that the 25% renewable standard is going to be very difficult to meet in certain regions of the country. And one of the ideas, one of the ways to lessen that burden would be to expand the list of qualifying energy sources, to recognize things such as methane recovery and waste to energy and distributed generation. What are your thoughts on expanding the list of qualifying energy sources to meet a 25% standard?
Well, with respect to the list you just gave, I support it. I think that there are good reasons to expand certainly the qualified renewables to include methane conversion, which is, as you know, from a global warming perspective, that's a double winner, and definitely ought to be encouraged. I think that there's some merit to allowing a piece of a renewable portfolio standard to be met by accelerated achievement in energy efficiency as well. As a general matter, we like to keep them separate, and there are good reasons for that. But for some regions of the country where they think that it's going to take longer to get the renewables going, allow some efficiency, early action on efficiency to qualify.
And just a final question, because I just have 7 seconds left, just a show of hands. How many on the panel would support 100% auction of these credits?
Now or later?
Now, well, of course later, but right now. Just one? Okay, I see my time is up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Great. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, the ranking member of the full committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure where to start. I guess I'll start by complimenting Mr. Sturba. It's good to see you. When I walked in, you kind of changed your look. I thought I was looking at Ming the Magnificent of Flash Gordon, so, which is a good look, not a bad look.
I appreciate your taste, sir.
Yeah. Let me just start out by clarifying something that our distinguished subcommittee chairman said. One of the reasons we're apparently doing this bill is to become less dependent on imported oil, which I support the goal. How much imported oil is used in the generation of electricity among the member companies of EEI?
Mr. Barton, I don't recall the specific number. It's fairly small.
It's close to zero.
It might be in the 1% range.
Yeah. So we're not going to get a lot out of this bill because the imported oil is going for the transportation industry. It's not going for the power generation industry.
That's correct, and I think that's where plug-in hybrids come in for the future.
Yeah. Well, speaking of plug-in hybrids, hybrids are made in my district down in Arlington, Texas. The additional cost of the hybrid is such that it never pays for itself. At $4 a gallon gasoline, it took somewhere between 10 to 15 years. At $2 gasoline, you're buying a hybrid just because you want to buy a hybrid. There's no payback to it. And in any scenario, the GM plant in my district that makes the GMC hybrid, the Cadillac hybrid, they have the capacity to make approximately 60 per hour. In the entire country, I'm told they're selling about 30 a week. So let's don't kid ourselves. Unless we force America, and I mean force them, this theology that everybody's going to transit to an electric vehicle or a hybrid vehicle, unless it's mandated by federal law backed up by the Army, it's not going to happen. I do want to thank you, Mr. English, for reminding the committee of jurisdiction that when we passed the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, which I voted for too, we explicitly didn't include CO2. It wasn't serendipitous that we just kind of forgot about it. We debated it and thought about it, and we didn't think that CO2 was a pollutant and needed to be regulated as a criteria pollutant under the Clean Air Act. The Republican alternative is going to, when we put it out for this bill, is going to have a provision from Congresswoman Blackburn, a member of the committee, that explicitly states that, which is something that I think the committee members need to keep in mind. Mr. Michaels, I want to ask you a question since you talked a little bit about cost. Could you explain to the committee and to me how raising the price of any commodity, in this case CO2, can be absorbed without being passed on to anybody in the economy, which is apparently what my friends on the other side think they can do?
The fundamentals of supply and demand say that no matter what kind of increase in price, increase in tax there is, there's going to be part of it is going to be borne by consumers, part of it may be borne by producers. By consumers as higher prices, by producers as having lower profits, fewer funds that they can reinvest in their businesses. The exact details of how the numbers break down in the carbon case is a subject of considerable debate, and certainly in California they haven't settled that issue yet.
But let's assume that by some miracle, Mr. Doyle, my good friend, can come up with an allowance system that doesn't cost anybody anything. Then there's no reason to use less of the commodity that's being capped, is there, if there's no cost to it?
But the only way that could happen would be if allowances were redundant and it was as good as if they didn't exist at all.
Well, my time's about to expire, Mr. Chairman. I do want to compliment you. Yesterday I learned that the oil and gas in Alaska is there as a result of continental plate shift. And I'm sure that I may learn something of a similar value as this hearing progresses with the other 20 witnesses that we have today. So I'm going to yield back the balance of my time.
Thanks, gentlemen. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Anderson.
Thank you. I'm glad my friend Mr. Barton mentions Alaska, because as we speak, the tundra of Alaska is melting because of carbon dioxide. The polar ice cap is disappearing because of carbon dioxide. The oceans that sustain the salmon fishery of Alaska are becoming much more acidic because of carbon dioxide. So I just want to ask you a preliminary question, to the extent I hope you can answer yes or no pretty much to this question. I want to just ask each of you very quickly to answer this. Do you believe that the threats associated with the pollutant carbon dioxide and the threats of changing the climate and the acidity of our oceans are significant enough to the United States that we should endeavor to cap, to limit the amount of this pollution in the atmosphere, Mr. Sturba?
Yes.
I think we're doing it no matter what.
Yes, Mr. Congressman.
Yes, Mr. Congressman.
Yes, NARUC supports taking federal action on to reduce carbon emissions.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Science is not yet clear enough to make a decision on the drastic policy.
Could you turn on your microphone so we could hear this?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
The science is not yet clear enough to make a decision on as drastic a policy as this.
Yes.
The reason I asked that question is that we have two very significantly different approaches. One side of this committee believes that this problem demands action. One side believes that this is not a problem and therefore has not proposed any action to deal with this problem. So I take the majority of your answers to be that these industries suggest we need action. And there has been, and there will be much criticism of the proposal we have made to take action on this problem. But we have made a proposal. We have stepped up to the plate to suggest one cause of action. We have come up with ideas on how to solve this problem. And simply sniping at this particular proposal, although in the finest American tradition, is not going to help us solve this problem. And I look forward to one day where all members of this committee can start being part of the solution rather than being part of the problem and not taking any action. So I want to ask about the action that we should take. First, a question I want to ask is, could someone help us on the best way to assist the siting of transmission? I do believe in this bill there are some additional measures we should consider, that as these renewable sources start to come online with concentrated solar, offshore wind, we are going to see a significant increase for need for transmission lines, and I think we need some backstop federal authority to site those. I'll turn to Mr. English for his thoughts in this regard.
Well, thank you very much, and let me just say I would respond that we've got a more practical situation in front of us right now. I think the Clean Air Act is going to be used to address this issue, and I think that this committee and the Congress needs to make sure that we have something that is deliberately passed to address the carbon issue. Second is renewables have got to play a huge role in this thing, and from a practical standpoint, we've got to move very rapidly if, in fact, this legislation is going to be timely as far as, and I think that's what you intend.
Yeah, are you when you say move rapidly, you're referring to transmission?
And particularly transmission. I think efficiency, we've got to be very aggressive on it, and quite frankly, I don't think we're anywhere close to what we need to be done on that. Second thing, I think as far as transmission is concerned, I understand, not in my backyard, I don't want any part of it, but quite frankly, if given the amount of reliance that I expect that we're going to have on renewable energy and what I think probably the authors of this bill intend, we have to have that siting, and probably we need the siting yesterday, not tomorrow, not 2 years from now, not 5 years. We cannot build the renewable energy that's going to be necessary to move this country forward and to even approach 15% or 20%, much less 25%, unless that siting is done within the next 2 years.
We'll be making some suggestions to the committee about how to move that forward in future drafts of the bill, and we hope any and all of you could help us with your insights on how to draft that. Very quickly, as we recycle the money from the auction proceeds, and I do believe there should be 100% or high level of auction, except for the permits that Mr. Doyle and I have fashioned a measure to go back to energy-intensive manufacturing industries. But as we recycle that, what is the best way to do it if we want to encourage the use of those recycled dollars back to consumers to use it for efficiency improvements? Is it just increasing the weatherization program, or should we have some voucher program? Take about a 20-second answer, if the chair will allow, from someone. I'm going to outgo Mr. Cowart.
We need an entire suite of energy efficiency programs. It includes weatherization. It includes assistance to industries. It includes assistance for retooling factories. It includes commercial energy efficiency as well. The local distribution companies or other trustees appointed by and supervised by state regulators are the best means to ensure that these dollars are returned to customers in the form of enhanced efficiency.
Mr. Greenstein, I'm kind of out of time. I want to respect the chair's
quickly, Mr. Greenstein.
I was just going to say, in terms of consumers' efficiency investments, you're going to get consumers investing more in home efficiencies themselves, if they see the price signal in their utility bills and they are made whole by a direct payment, so they still see if you artificially keep the bill down, there's going to be less incentive for them to themselves take conservation and efficiencies.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First question I have for each of you, and I want a yes or no answer. Have you read the draft discussion bill yourself in its entirety? Mr. Bassett?
Yes.
Mr. Michaels? No. Mr. Greenstein?
In its entirety, no. Parts of it, yes.
Mr. Cowart?
Same answer.
Mr. Morgan?
Same answer.
Same answer.
Not entirely.
Not entirely.
Not entirely.
Thank you. I haven't either, but I'm just about there. 648 pages, and I think I'm down to about 603 right now. The reason I ask that is not to put you on the hot seat, except that our job here is to legislate. So every word matters, despite what my colleagues on the other side may think, that we're not supposed to ask questions. I intend to ask questions, and I intend to pursue this pretty aggressively because I think we're about to put into law a policy that will have enormous ramifications for consumers, small businesses, every American, and our future. And so I am going to take my time, and I may invoke my rights under the House rules, which cannot be superseded by this committee, to get 5 minutes for each of you for questions, because I think it's that important of an issue. So let's start out. Mr. English, I appreciate your testimony today and your work on behalf of the rural electric co-ops. You have a very good organization, and I've worked closely with the members in my district. Explain to me how the provisions in this bill affect your members, a lot of them very small little cooperatives out across very rural landscapes, when it comes to them participating in an auction. Can you explain to me how they compete with a 5-member board or a 10-member board out in Hood River or John Day or somewhere?
We don't think even our largest members can compete in that kind of an environment in an auction. It would be extremely difficult for us to do so. And let me also say that doesn't even take into account the regional ramifications of an auction.
And yet in the Northwest, we have enormous wind energy. A lot of it in my district. I'm proud of it. But I also know that one of the great synergistic actions there is being able to use the hydro system as a storage battery. There are provisions in this legislation that both completely discriminate against hydroelectric power as renewable, if it was online prior to 2001, as well as any new hydro is not considered renewable if in some way it affects the pool level behind a storage facility at any time or any location. Doesn't that pretty much rule out new hydro as a battery for wind?
I think it is a mistake to eliminate any kind of renewable whatsoever. We are looking at biomass. We're looking at all different aspects of generating renewable energy. But again, I want to go back that the biggest limitation on renewable energy is transmission and is the question of siting.
I'm going to bring this up again. This is Bonneville Power's hourly measurements of wind energy in the Northwest. And you see the dramatic drop in output of wind. You have to have something to balance it out. We're going to move forward with renewable energy, which is a good thing, but it cannot be done in a vacuum. So can somebody explain to me how you do not need other power sources that you can bring online rapidly to balance this out? The same would go with solar at night.
I'll just say very quickly, you're right.
Appreciate that. Let's talk about natural gas. Does anybody believe here that this legislation will not drive up the cost of natural gas?
For the reasons that were mentioned earlier, clearly, even your example related to intermittent sources of power from renewable, that will require generation that can back it up. Natural gas is the quickest source of new facilities that can come on the quickest to back that up.
And so everybody's agreeing, yes, natural gas price. Anybody disagree? And I don't mean to move fast, but I'm down to a minute. Smart grid. I'm going to go back to Mr. English on this. As I read this legislation, everybody with that serves a power customer is going to have a plan put in place rather rapidly on how to deal with plug-in hybrids and a smart grid technology. Now, out in Fossil, Oregon, there's one person for every 9 miles of power line. Can you explain to me if there's a cost associated with that smart grid technology and that plug-in requirement here, and how that would be addressed?
Well, first of all, let me just say that we don't.
And I drive hybrids, by the way, despite my ranking members.
First of all, we don't have a clear definition of what smart grid means. Second, we're very proud, of course, electric cooperatives seem to be well in advance of the rest of the industry, according to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in this area. Third is we think the very need for efficiency is going to drive a good deal of new technology. And fourth, you have to have flexibility to address the kind of situations that you have locally.
Mr. Chairman, I realize my time for this round has run out. I would encourage you each to read this bill in its entirety, word for word, because every word in this bill has an enormous impact, and I can't wait till we get into trying to figure out biomass, which is, if it comes off of federal land, is not renewable, and probably not even off private forest land, and why municipal solid waste converted into energy is not renewable. There are a lot of questions here, Mr. Chairman, and I hope we get time to ask them.
I thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The main electric utility in my district is the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, popularly known as SMUD. It consistently receives high marks of customer satisfaction while investing significantly in energy efficiency and renewable energy development. SMUD supports a transparent cap-and-trade system to get greenhouse gases under control. It has also undertaken a number of positive and voluntary programs that have helped people control their energy usage and increase the amount of energy they use from renewable sources. SMUD is highly supportive of allocating emission allowances directly to the LDCs, of which SMUD is one. The idea behind this is that LDCs are able to pass potential savings directly onto their ratepayers while avoiding windfall profits. Mr. Sturba, I know that SMUD agrees with you that allocation should be distributed directly to LDCs. I know this is one of the main issues that this committee will have to deal with before marking up the draft legislation before us. So I'd like to delve a little bit more deeply into the details. SMUD tells me that giving allowances directly to LDCs will protect against windfalls to generators and eliminate opportunities for market manipulation. Why do you think that LDCs are in a better position than anywhere else along the energy supply chain to protect the consumer welfare and guard against windfall profits?
The distribution company is, in our instances, for shareholder-owned utilities, are regulated. The regulator is familiar with how to handle the costs and the benefits of trading in allowances. It's done today relative to SOX and in many instances NOx. So we have proven mechanisms by which those benefits from an allowance are flowed through to customers. And I know that that would continue to exist.
Let's assume for a moment that some of the emission allocations under this bill will be auctioned. In the case of an auction, is it your opinion that LDCs should also receive the lion's share of the auction revenue to pass through to the ratepayers?
In the instance that for the allocated share of allowances associated with electric generation, as it is allocated, as that auction moves on, I believe the Congress should consider providing the value of those allowances, cash, if you will, back to the regulated entity to help mitigate impact if it chooses not to do an allocation. The much simpler way is to allocate and allow the Commission in each state to oversee how those values are provided back to consumers.
Okay, just to follow up on that, we need to ensure as much as discretionary auction revenues go toward complementary policies to mitigate and adapt to climatic change. How are the LDCs positioned relative to other entities in the supply chain to ensure that the auction revenue is spent on activities that will reduce further global warming, emissions, weatherization, renewables, efficiency, et cetera?
I think there are certainly other things that can be done with proceeds resulting from auctions. For example, in helping ensure there's a very robust weatherization program. The use of those funds to invest in technology. If what we're about is creating a mechanism or a set of mechanisms to reduce our carbon footprint Why should not all of the value that's associated with imposing these costs on the economy be used for that purpose?
Okay, in your testimony, you referenced the oil fund payment that Alaskans receive every year. I was thinking about the Alaska situation earlier this week, and it seems to me that returning money directly to consumers in this way might sound good politically, but would create problems down the line when the emissions cap starts to drive down the amount of revenue generated from the cap-and-trade program. How can we best ensure that consumers are assisted with temporary higher energy costs without making them dependent on a rebate payment from the federal government?
The absolute simplest way is to provide an allocation to the LDC such that that cost is never incurred by the consumer. Prices, I agree with Mr. Cowart that prices don't drive everything. And so having that allocation made to the LDC such that that cost is not passed back on to consumers is the best appropriate strategy.
Okay, so the role that the LDCs play in ensuring the allocation revenues, you can really believe the LDCs can really play an effective role in essence, in the allocation revenues?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Looks like my time is almost up, so thank you.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a great start to start really hashing out the numbers as we tried to address yesterday. And I would appeal to the chairman that once they decide on a mark, that we have a hearing on the numbers. I also appeal to the chairman that I know you want to move this fast, that enough time is given for everyone to score this out. And let me just ask that to the panel. I did this yesterday. Do you agree that transparency is better than the lack of transparency in this process? Everyone agree with that? Everybody shaking their head yes. Would it be better for us to know the numbers that are proposed a week prior to the markup of a bill? Does everyone agree with that? Transparent process? Everyone agree? Mm-hmm. Yes, everybody shaking their head yes? Mm-hmm. I'm assuming everybody's shaking their head yes. No one is willing to go on record saying, no, we'd rather not have a full and a transparent process at least a week amount of time. Should we have time and a full transparent process and time to allow people who are making the economic analysis, the numbers, so that a proper economic analysis of the impacts, good or bad, those that will help move to a green economy and those that may, does everybody agree that that should be part of this process, a full, transparent, regular order process so we can debate this? Anyone disagree with that? So everyone is agreeing, Mr. Chairman. So I would hope that in this, and there's great divergent opinions, and we've got a lot of committees and a lot of processes, the marker's really down for these numbers to be laid out in time for us to really have a credible debate. Now, why is this important? It's important because there's going to be job losses. There's a supposition that there'll be job gains. There are some people claiming that there will be an equal amount of job losses to job gains. I reject that proposal. I think the Spanish study also rejects it. For every one job created, there were 2 jobs lost. And so we will continue to focus on job creation. Why is this important to me? You all talked about the Clean Air Act, the 90 amendments. We cannot use the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments and say that the cap-and-trade provision on a small amount of emittance with available technology is related to the huge amount of captured emittance, if you want to call carbon dioxide, and the inability to have any technology to do it at this time. Peabody Mine number 10, Kincaid, Illinois. Fuel switching, Mr. Chairman, that's what this natural gas debate is. Fuel switching cost 1,200 mine workers, United Mine Workers jobs in one coal mine. and the commodity was switched. There was a fuel switch. These guys lost their jobs. Done poorly, with no transparency, you're going to have fuel switching, and I'm going to lose more. The number I like to use was even more, and they came out in our hearings with the chairman's, to the chairman's credit. We had the Ohio Mine Association here a couple weeks ago. You know how many mine workers' jobs were lost during the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments in Ohio? 35,000 mine workers' jobs. Now, what does that mean to rural America? For this piece of coal from Willow Creek Mine, underground employment, 411 miners. The prep plant has 51. This is just mine. 462 jobs. This is in rural, poor, southeastern Illinois. The total economic impact for this one mine in poor, southeastern Illinois is $123 million. That's money that goes to the local schools, to the local roads, to the local county, to hire sheriffs. That's what's endangered if we don't do this right. If we're going to fuel switch to natural gas, these jobs are lost. Natural gas is high, especially, Mr. Chairman, if we don't move to more exploration, location, and recovery of natural gas emissions. Appreciate your panel. You know, the fight continues. I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the issue of allowances is really at the heart of cap and trade. It's difficult, and it's politically difficult. So I appreciate the diversity of opinions that are expressed here this morning. And I think this panel represents the diversity of the opinions of the American public. So if we can work in the face of this diversity to find something that's passable by this committee and by the House, I think we'll have something that'll be beneficial and it'll work. Personally, I believe in terms of allocations, that we should go as far upstream as possible, but I realize that politically, for a number of legitimate reasons, that isn't going to happen. And so I appreciate the spirit of compromise shown by Mr. Greenstein in biting your tongue and saying, well, okay, we'll work with the LDC. So I hope that the committee can work in that spirit and find a legislation that we can live with. Now I have a couple of questions. Mr. Sturba, I think your presentation was very good. I appreciate that. I lived in New Mexico for many years, so I understand the situation. We've seen, though, in the past, a recent past, the opponents of clean energy crying wolf in the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, and to a lesser degree with the Montreal Protocol, and yet those catastrophic predictions were never borne out. And in fact, we saw a good benefit at very little cost. So I'd like to ask you what you think made these estimates so wrong, and what lessons can we learn from that experience?
I think in the instance of the Clean Air Act amendments for sulfur dioxide, for example, it is that, and the point that was made by Mr. Shimkus is true. There were technologies that could be used, and what happened is that they ended up costing a lot less than people assumed. And it's the power of a market, and that's the value, I think, of a cap-and-trade system, is it capitalizes on that power of a market to drive the costs for compliance down. So where $3,000 was an expected value for the cost of an allowance, turned out to be $300. So I think that's one of the things we want to capture. The difference here is there are some new technologies that must be developed, carbon capture and storage, to ensure that it is available, and that's what we have to get to.
Well, thank you. One of the things that's sticky in California particularly is that we've invested a lot in efficiency, and how do we get credit for that early efficiency? Mr. Cowart, could you take a stab at that? How could we give credit in allowances for this?
There are actually two answers to that question. First is the good news. And the good news is that as I talk to people in California, they think they have an advantage in an environment that such as the one we're entering, because in California you know how to do energy efficiency, and that actually you're not disadvantaged by the fact that you have in place the human capital and the experience to do the job. But to answer your question directly, it's through the selection of a baseline period for the allocation to LDCs. We're proposing an allocation to LDCs in part based upon consumption levels, and it's important that that selection of consumption level be done in such a way as to reward successful performance over time in the delivery of efficiency. So that if you're successful tomorrow, for example, in delivering efficiency to your customers, that next year your allocation doesn't go down just because of that. And the same thing could be said in terms of backcasting to a baseline.
Thank you. You know, the Edison Electric Institute is leading the effort in terms of small grid, and I appreciate that because I spent many years in 1990s developing a smart grid, a utility meter for residential use. So I think there's potential there. One of the things that I think gives the greatest potential is the marrying smart meters with hybrid vehicles. Could you comment on that, Mr. Serbo?
Well, smart meters are a part of the smart grid, and it's an essential component of it that allows communication to occur in two directions instead of only just in one. And we absolutely, in order to facilitate plug-in hybrids, which today have a cost disadvantage, but frankly, I personally believe that will change dramatically over time, we have to be able to help ensure that those vehicles can not just be users of electricity, but also storers of electricity for the benefit of the grid. And that means that you have to have a meter or the capacity to measure electricity going both ways and to communicate price signals so that the ability for someone who owns a plug-in hybrid to support the grid can be recognized on an economic basis.
Thank you. It looks like my time's expired.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Michaels, we often hear that California is a leader in climate change policy. You testify that people using California as an example of effective energy efficiency policy have an untenable case. Would you elaborate on that?
Well, I just went through several basic points about it. Yes, there are some California energy efficiency programs that have delivered. But as a simple fact, the California Energy Commission has always looked at projected resource needs in the future, and they have almost invariably overestimated what the likely contribution of efficiency is going to be.
If you could look at the policy of California on climate change, what would be the main lesson that we could draw from California utility policies?
It's infinitely more complicated than anyone could imagine, and there's no precedent for it. Everybody who talks about using some model to get numbers, the bad news is you're talking about something unbelievably complex, as much so as the whole economy plus the whole ecosystem. We don't know how to do this. The projections you get, if you look at the federal figures, use models from the Energy Information Administration, which itself has shown what incredibly poor predictors of things they are in its own documents.
Some of your fellow panelists advocate different types of allocation schemes to protect consumers. Are there any schemes that will truly insulate consumers and small businesses from the cost impacts of this cap and trading scheme?
How could there be? After all, what you're doing is making something that was formerly free, namely the right to emit carbon, scarce. All you've done is you've increased the cost of doing business for businesses. You've increased the cost of living for consumers ultimately because some of that's going to be passed on to them. There's no way to insulate the entire economy or even a major segment of it from as massive a scarcity as we're thinking about creating here.
Now, you said, Dr. Michaels, every major provision of this bill is at base a tax. Would you elaborate on that? Why is the renewable electricity standard a tax, for instance?
The renewable electricity standard is not a federal tax that's going to be explicitly paid to this government. But what it is it's a mandate upon states that their utilities catch a certain fraction of their power from renewables over the course of time in the future. Renewables are not cost effective now. We don't know when, if ever, they're going to be. Even wind, which is the most common renewable, and renewable is almost a synonym for wind, still is not cost effective without a federal subsidy, production tax credit, and accelerated depreciation. We're talking about people's electric bills rising because regulators have to fold these costs in for regulated utilities. That's as good as a tax.
From your understanding of the issue, Dr. Michaels, would imposing this tax on energy lead to any meaningful global emissions reductions?
I'm not an expert on that, but I'm aware that as a fraction of global emissions, the U.S. is relatively small. And my understanding, and I'm not an expert again, is that it's going to take a much larger increase than is ever contemplated in this legislation to make a dent in it.
Now, you say the bill will have massive effects on both consumers and small businesses. Does anyone on the panel disagree with that? Mr. Cowart?
Well, I'll disagree to this extent. To the degree that we're smart about how we implement it, and to the degree that we recycle revenue that advances highly efficient technologies, the impacts on consumers and businesses can be quite moderated.
I think the impact is going to be disproportionate, and that's why I've underscored any approach should be an approach that recognizes regional differences. Obviously, some consumers in certain parts of the country are going to be disproportionately impacted because of their coal dependency, and so any formula needs to take that into consideration.
Mr. Greenstein, you wonder?
It all depends on how the legislation is designed. Well-designed legislation that makes appropriate use of auction proceeds and permit allocations, as I've indicated, can hold low and middle-income consumers harmless generally. And with regard to businesses, while I don't think, I want to amend the answer I gave earlier to Mr. Upton, while I don't think it makes sense to do allowances generally for businesses, there may be particular businesses or particular sectors that need transition help of some sort, whether it's through allowances or other mechanisms. I'm not sure what the best mechanism is.
Dr. Michaels, what's your response to that?
It's not at all clear to me how, again, it simply reduces to a question of scarcity. All you are doing is making something scarce that was relatively abundant before, and there's no way, there are ways to make a little bit more or a little bit less be borne by one class of customers or another. But by and large, this is very, very small relative to the totality that's being contemplated here if I look at the bill.
My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Mr. Morgan, currently, what percentage of the District of Columbia electricity is produced by what's defined as renewable electricity in this bill?
Well, the District of Columbia currently imports more than 98% of its electricity from outside, so it's a little bit hard to answer that question. We do have some solar generation on some federal facilities and universities and a growing number of homes.
But you don't have a percentage?
I don't. It is, I can tell you it's very small.
Okay. I think as a customer, and some members are customers, I remember, you know, on a yearly basis, we get ours in our bill showing what percentage, and it is very small. I think less than 1%. At least from the
we do have a requirement for the load-serving entities to report on the energy mix. Most of that power is imported and includes renewables.
Well, again, whether you import it or what, because we import power. In fact, that's the goal of this bill, is be able to import power from parts of the country that generate it to parts that don't. So, but it's still the mandate would cover it. And I noticed the public counsel for Columbia's People Council, Betty Knoll, was concerned about the 20% mandate that the district's standard would cost about $26 million annually. Does the D.C. Currently have a 20% mandate?
Yes, the City Council recently increased the renewables portfolio standard for the district to eventually reach 20% in the year 2020. That's correct.
Okay. Let me ask our other from groups, the co-ops, the EEI, and in the public sector. What are the percentage, Glenn, or does co-ops actually have? And I know you had a discussion on what is considered. I know the bill actually considers qualified hydropower, but what is a percentage of the rural co-ops that have, and what would be defined as renewable energy in the bill?
As I mentioned, it'd be 11, as defined by the bill, it'd be about down to about 2%. Okay. Would be roughly what we have.
General hydropower is not quote qualified.
That's correct.
Okay. Same in the case of the publics, Mr. Congressman. As customers of the power marketing administrations, they use a lot of hydroelectric. But if you're not including hydroelectric from either the PMAs or the generation that's owned by our members, it's right around the industry average, which is about 3%.
Okay. And I think on the investor-owned side, that may be a little higher than the general average because we are complying with mandates in a number of states, but it's certainly in no higher than 4% overall.
Okay. And I guess the last one would be well, and that's EEI, I guess, the investor-owned. Okay, thank you. That's, I guess, our concern on the electric, a national standard of 25%, although 25 by 25. And to get there, and I know in the state of Texas we're doing so many things with wind power, and actually our Public Utility Commission committed $5 billion to transmit that power within to get to the Dallas-Fort Worth, the urban markets, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston, Galveston. And the legislature now is expanding solar compared to what they did with wind power. But there's some concern we still may not be able to do 25% in 2025, even with the growth that we're doing. Is there a response to that compared to other states?
Mr. Congressman, I just add that the 15% limit that we support for a federal RES is really a very aggressive standard. When you look at the fact that right now the total national renewable resource capacity, excluding hydro, is about 3% in 2008, we're talking about a five-fold increase in a little over 10 years with 15%. And even with the recent state renewable energy standards Mr. Sturba referred to in the recent years, the year-over-year increase has been about 5%. To get just to 15%, you're talking about nearly a 14% year-over-year increase. I mean, it's a very aggressive standard.
Okay.
I would echo that, Mr. Green, and add one other thing, that it's not just the percentage, but it's also what qualifies.
Okay.
And that can dramatically change whether or not you can get to that standard. There's also an electrical stability issue associated with intermittent generation. You have to be careful.
Okay. Mr. Bassett, in the few seconds I have left, some have discussed the EPA's preliminary and economic analysis, and have you had a chance to review it?
Yes.
And it does not assume an RES or a low-carbon fuel standard. Do you have any thoughts on the EPA's analysis, the economic analysis?
Well, I said earlier I thought it was a great first step, but it doesn't go far enough because there are overlapping mandates in this particular draft that have to be taken into consideration. I would think the committee would be remiss if they would move forward without having a complete analysis of all of the variables that are included in the draft, and then further understand what the simultaneous implementation of all those provisions would have that impact on consumers. So while I applaud it as a good first step, I don't think it goes far enough in dealing with the other provisions in the draft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my first question is for Mr. Sturba and Mr. English, Mr. Christen. What is your position with regards to implementing a domestic cap-and-trade program before there's a substantial and verifiable commitment to emissions reductions by China, India, and similar emission-heavy developing nations?
EEI's position is that we believe that the U.S. should provide leadership and go forward with a some form of climate change legislation, but it must be in the context of international negotiations to help bring along the other countries, because if we're the only ones that do it, we don't get there. But neither do, and this is my personal statement, do I believe we can just say we won't do anything until the others do it first.
We agree that other countries should be included, and certainly someone of the magnitude of China needs to be a party to this. I think there is an issue of who goes first. And as I said, the problem that we face right now is that we're going first unless the Congress wants to stop that through the Clean Air Act. I think the Supreme Court started that ball rolling nearly 2 years ago. So I suppose we're leading, but I certainly think that the Congress needs to do everything they can to get other countries to join with us.
Yes, Mr. Congressman, we would support moving ahead with a workable and sustainable cap and trade system or some kind of mechanism to address climate change in order to show leadership in the international community. We would be very concerned, however, if there was not some kind of reciprocity shown in the very near future by countries like China and India.
All right. And the next question is for, I guess, all of the panelists. What are your concerns or position on leakage, the process by which companies will move business operations to foreign countries to avoid higher costs in the U.S.? I guess let's go down the line. Yeah. Go ahead.
In California, that's been a very, very major issue with the implementation of the state program. And even the most optimistic projections that are coming from people who have been analyzing the state program, I don't place much faith in them, but even the most optimistic ones are that California is going to lose a very substantial fraction of what industrial load is left. Essentially, what's going to be left in California is only the kind of businesses that can't move because of their closeness to the consumer. Electrically, you're going to be seeing the same issue, and that's being played out once again, not just in California, but in the negotiations over the Western Climate Initiative. If California outlaws coal-fired power imports, it just means the plants in other states are going to produce electricity for those residents.
I think my answer to that question is obvious. Anytime there is a possibility for loss of jobs, whether it's major corporations or small businesses that will certainly be affected by this draft, they're concerned. And so that's why I think that going forward, we need to make certain that we're considering all of the variables. And that's why I've underscored my initial concerns earlier.
Anyone else?
Leakage is certainly a problem in any cap and trade regime, and we need to be really careful about how we approach it. It's one of the reasons that we need a national program, frankly, because of the state-to-state competition problems that cause leakage across state borders. And with respect to international arrangements, I support transitional assistance to industries that are affected by international trade concerns. And I think I echo the comments of those made earlier that we as a nation need to be engaged quite actively with other countries to make sure that we create over time as level a playing field as we can.
I agree with Mr. Coward. I think we need to look at the issue of leakage in the context of an international approach, the fact that that the United States is thus far not part of international agreements already is creating a leakage problem in the other direction. What we really need to do is work together with other nations to address this problem. And I also wanted to highlight the issue of leakage when you're looking at state or regional programs, which are already in place in parts of the U.S. And as Mr. Coward said, that is a problem that can be solved by developing a national program and having arrangements for dealing with interchange between U.S. and Canada of electricity and that sort of thing.
We have already seen in the past the comment about rush to gas. We have seen that impact businesses and industries in our areas when we had gas used so much for power generation. What this has the potential to do, in addition to increasing the demand for natural gas, if we have carbon allowance costs for residential customers and small businesses, it has the potential to impact their businesses and do just what you fear. So for those reasons, we think it's necessary that we deal with the allowances and allocating those in the appropriate way to mitigate that impact.
Yes, Mr. Congressman, we share that concern, and as Mr. Somerhalder pointed out, this is one of the big advantages of 100% allocation of allowances, particularly in the transition in the early years as we move to a low-carbon energy system.
I agree. One of the biggest challenges that we can face is not just thinking about what's the impact on electricity, but what's the impact on the mix. If we throw coal out prematurely out of the mix, we can have a significant impact on natural gas prices that not only affect residential customers, but all of the industries that use it as feedstock, and the inability for them to remain competitive in an international market.
Thank you. The gentleman's time is expired. Thank you. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Two of the issues that have been raised constantly, among others, are the impact on jobs, but also the impact on cost, the cost to the consumer. Mr. Cowart, welcome. You and I worked together in Vermont and appreciate the work you did there and around the country and the world. I'd ask you to further elaborate on the potential of efficiency as a means of reducing energy cost. I mean, if we are going to be concerned about the consumer, as we must, residential consumer and the business consumer, to elaborate on how efficiency can be their friend.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the efficiency opportunity is well demonstrated throughout the country. The reservoir is large and it's largely untapped, and it can be tapped at low cost. We know that in the power sector we could achieve at least 1%, probably 2% a year in total demand reduction incrementally through aggressive energy efficiency programs that would be cost effective. They would save customers more money than they cost. And what happens when you do that is really four things. First of all, every customer who is participating in an efficiency program or is investing in efficiency will see a lower bill. That's the first benefit. The second benefit is that by reducing demand for electricity and natural gas, we reduce the clearing prices, and those benefits occur to everybody on the system. So the upward pressure that we're worried about here on clean energy and on energy prices generally can be significantly moderated by energy efficiency at the customer level. The third benefit is that by reducing demand for consumption, we actually reduce demand for carbon allowances. And this is part of the answer to Dr. Michael's concern about scarcity. I mean, one of the ways to affect any scarce resource is to reduce demand for it, which can be done through energy efficiency, reducing demand for carbon allowances. And then the last point, for the half of the United States that exists in a competitive wholesale power market arena, is that when you reduce clearing prices and when you reduce carbon prices, you're reducing the cost of power across almost all megawatt hours across the entire grid. So the benefits from being a lot smarter about efficiency can be quite widespread.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Greenstein, given your proposal and your concerns about LDCs, but the objective you have to protect consumers, what are your thoughts on allocating allowances, 15%, I think is a figure people have used, to LDCs, specifically for efficiency to reduce cost to consumers?
I don't have any specific percentage. I agree with Mr. Cowart and others that efficiency is important. I'm not an expert on what is the best way under this bill to achieve the efficiency gains. To the degree that allocating permits to LDCs specifically for efficiency would be the best or one of the best ways to get efficiency gains, if that's the case, then I would think it's a good idea. I certainly think that there ought to be some efficiency investment under this legislation.
Okay, Mr. Sturba, what about you? Is efficiency got to be a core component of any approach to address this problem?
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the areas where state regulators come into play in helping develop, along with utilities, the elimination of disincentives and the provision of incentives such that we maximize energy efficiency capacity.
And what would you define as the specific disincentives to utilities to aggressively promote efficiency?
One that exists in many jurisdictions today is the fact that you're incented to sell more of a product. That's
right.
Wrong. We need to change that fundamental business model.
Which we would do by what?
Well, it can be done by a number of mechanisms. People use the phrase decoupling as
right.
one. The problem is it means a lot of different things to different people, but there are clearly mechanisms that we can change that business model.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired. Who's next? Do we have anybody else? Okay. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the members of the panel. Let me try to go through a series of questions. Mr. Sturba, let me begin with you. Certain energy sources are subsidized by the federal government. What I'd like to do is see if you can tell me, if you can quantify for me how much, whether it's by kilowatt or by megawatt, the subsidy for natural gas is. Do you know that number?
I do not.
Would you assume it's zero or near zero? Does anybody in the panel know? How about the subsidy for coal per megawatt or kilowatt? Mr. English?
When you get in and you talk about the issue of subsidy, that gets to be very misleading. Now, if you're talking about using the tax code and providing benefits under the tax code as being part of that subsidy, then I think every fuel has a subsidy. Every fuel receives assistance.
Do you know how much?
What I'm trying to do is get amounts. I don't have amounts.
I'm trying to get the relative amount of the subsidy. We know there's a substantial subsidy for solar. Is that correct? Does somebody know how much it is per megawatt?
Currently, the production tax credit is, I believe, 2.1 cents for renewables, and then it could also be investment tax credit, which is 30%, I believe.
So, can you give me a number per megawatt for solar, or
well, the production tax credit would be 2.1 cents or $21 a megawatt hour.
Okay, and then the other one you mentioned?
Well, that would be applicable to any renewable at this time. I would agree with Mr. English. There are certain built subsidies that have occurred at different stages of fuel being developed. Any fuel source that was developed probably had some subsidies at different points in time.
Do you know what the current subsidy for wind is?
It would be, on the production tax credit, it would be the same, the 2.1 cents per kilowatt hour.
I thought it would be useful to know what those subsidies are relative one fuel to the other, natural gas or coal, relative to solar and wind. The next question I'd like to ask is to the entire panel, and I'd like to get a yes or no answer from each of you, if I might. Do you agree that this legislation, will increase the cost of energy produced in the United States, yes or no? Mr. Sturba?
Yes, the degree to which it does is dependent on
yes, the bill. Yes or no? I'm short on time.
Yes.
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 Qualified yes.
Qualified yes.
Yes.
Unqualified yes.
Yes. If you agree that it will in fact increase the cost of energy in the United States, do you also agree that it will increase the cost of all goods which require energy to produce them? Steel or anything?
Yes.
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 To the extent efficiency substitutes for energy, no.
Yes.
Yes.
In general, yes.
Dr. Michaels, did I get my unqualified yes?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Let me just ask you another. Isn't it in fact, and I think either Mr. Coward or Mr. Greenstein, you made this point, one of the goals of the legislation is to increase the cost of energy to induce the efficiency that you talk about, Mr. Coward, and to discourage the use or the consumption of energy. Isn't that correct, Mr. Sturba?
I think the purpose is to provide a price signal for a commodity that is, by public policy opinion, being made scarce.
Which you do by increasing cost, right?
Well, yes.
Thank you. Mr. English?
I'm not going to interpret motives here, but let me just say I think we have to say on the front end of it that it's basically to reduce the emission of carbons.
By sending a price signal?
It does set a price by putting a limitation on the carbon being used in the country. Yes, that sends a price signal.
Combination of cap and price.
I agree.
I actually don't think that the purpose is to raise the price. The purpose is to reduce emissions.
Did Mr. Morgan not respond?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well, I do agree that the purpose is to send a price signal. Putting a cap on the quantity is one way of doing that, but price
Well, you're putting
alone,
a cap. You're not putting a cap on the total quantity. You're putting the cap on the quantity per industry, and then charging for that for anyone. Actually, you might charge for that initial cap, and then also charge for exceeding the cap.
Well, either way, I mean, you are trying to make the product more scarce, as Dr. Michaels pointed out,
by increasing the price and sending a price signal.
That's correct. That is certainly part of the purpose. Of course, as we pointed out, there are some ways to offset that.
Sure. Yeah. We're not talking about offsetting it, but I'm just, does it in fact send a price signal, or isn't that a part of the structure of the bill, Mr. Cowart?
I think that a price signal is useful, but that the other policies that are inherent in the bill are actually more important.
Thank you, Mr. Green. I really was looking for, does it,
It's
one of the goals to send a price signal, increasing the price of the cost of energy so that we consume less and therefore reduce CO2 emissions.
A key purpose is to send a price signal both so that we consume less, but also that we switch to cleaner sources of energy. But the fact that it sends a price signal should not be interpreted to be a negative for the economy.
I was just asking the question. Don't read motives in my question, just Dr. Michaels?
It's a price signal. The real question with price is always, what are you getting for it? If in fact we're getting very little in the way of solutions to the whole world's carbon problem, then all we are doing is, it's a burnt offering type of sacrifice.
Mr. Bassett?
I won't ascribe motives to the drafters or to your question, but I will say that the net effect of setting a price signal in this instance will raise prices.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, my time is...
And I was wondering whether Mr. Michaels was an Old Testament or New Testament, which
I'm ready to go in that debate, Mr. Chairman, anytime.
The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier, I think some people involved in the discussion have implied that this is the only piece of legislation that's out there that addresses an energy policy. I would direct them to an alternative plan that's been on the table for about a year now and is actually still out there on debate, something that we're going to be presenting. Most of the components of this bill, the American Energy Act that was filed in the last Congress, will be filed again and debated as part of an alternative to this cap-and-trade energy tax, but it's a bill that actually involves in all of the above energy policy that will not only support and, in fact, fund research and development to advance the alternatives like wind and solar, but also make recognition of our own natural resources here in this country to explore additional natural resources like oil, like natural gas, the sources that we're using today, clean coal technology, and also nuclear power, which is a very reliable, efficient source of energy many other countries are using, that this cap-and-trade energy tax does not contemplate at all, and then also encourage people to make those efficiencies that they're making today that many more will make. So anybody who suggests that one group of people on this committee is just against everything, they're being very disingenuous, because this is a bill that's been out there for about a year now, many of the components of which will be presented as an alternative, a bill that will actually create American jobs here in this country, create those green jobs that we're talking about, but not invoke policies that will export millions of jobs out of this country, which the cap-and-trade energy bill clearly will do. No one has disputed those findings. And so with that, I go to the bill that we're debating today, and specifically the allocation policies that this panel is discussing. And I'm going to have some questions, but first, for those of us that have been going through this bill, one of the big frustrations that we feel is not only a frustration to us as members, I'm sure many of you who are trying to do analysis of this bill, but also to the American people who are trying to contemplate whether or not this is good policy or bad, is the main details of this bill, especially what this committee is talking about today on allocation policies. If you go to page 478 of the bill, which actually is supposed to be talking about the main source of how this whole cap and trade scheme would work. Let's go through disbursement of allowances and proceeds from auctions of allowances. Subsection A, allocation of emission allowances. The administrator shall allocate emission allowances established under Section 721 in the following amounts. So you want to go read those amounts. It says, to be supplied. Section's blank. You go next to Section B, auction of emission allowances. The administrator shall auction emission allowances established under Section 721 in the following amounts. To be supplied. Subsection 3, funds established. There is established in the Treasury of the United States the following funds. The Strategic Reserve Fund, 1. Number 2, other funds to be supplied. We're talking about what many people have described as one of the most important initiatives brought before this Congress in decades, the most important change in energy policy our country has probably seen, and the bulk of the details don't even exist today, aren't even presented to the public. Now, there's discussion that many of these details are being worked out behind closed doors, and some of those deals are being cut as we speak. Unfortunately, none of that's being done here in this committee meeting, where the transparency is supposed to be, where people can actually watch and participate in a discussion, where experts can actually give detailed analysis of the components of the bill and the policies that would affect every consumer in America. And so with that, I want to ask Mr. Bassett, because you've testified that you've talked about the rigorous cost analysis that you would like to see done on it. When it comes to the details of this bill that are completely left unanswered, how do you do a real cost analysis to estimate how much this is going to cost American families, how many jobs will be exported to foreign countries, when so many of the details are left out?
Well, you can't, and that's a concern that I have as I was reviewing the bill, and I know that consumers across the country are going to have. And so what I would do is encourage this committee, before you move, is to consider cost estimates on every provision that's in the bill, and then go further, as I've said earlier, then test for the impact that a simultaneous implementation of those are going to be. I just don't see how you can reach a conclusion as grave as this. I mean,
and I know we're running out of time. I'm sorry to cut you off. I would ask anybody on the panel if they would address the question, should we, and is it responsible to go forward with a debate on a bill this important when so many of the key components are not even included that we can assess, analyze, and discuss? Does anybody think it's responsible to be going forward with this right now? Nobody responded. I yield back my time.
Could I just say there's every reason to have debate on all the issues we already know, all the parts of the bill that are filled in, and what a number of us think or are recommending today should be in there for the parts of the bill that aren't filled in. And I presume at the appropriate time you'll get a fully filled in bill, and you'll all have further debate on it at that time. So this
right, and with 9 panelists, we probably have 9 different ideas that are very divergent on how that should be. Unfortunately, we should be all debating one set, because ultimately this committee would pass one set plan, not 9 different plans. Unfortunately, we can't debate that one set plan because it doesn't exist and it's not before us today.
I think the gentleman's time has expired. Unless the gentleman from New York has questions, then all time for questioning for this panel has been completed. But you have provided a very valuable set of testimonies for the committee, and I can actually see some, I won't call them deals, but I can actually see some new working arrangements that could be constructed out of your testimony to create a format, to create a formula that we might be able to use. And amongst your testimony, I think that it has been perhaps the most productive that we've had so far, because these are very thorny questions, but yet I can see a lot of desire to find a working formula that we could use, and we thank you for your test. The gentleman from Oregon.
Yeah, I'm not going to trigger the House 5-minute rule, but I would just, following on what you said, because somebody here on the panel mentioned the importance of worker transition during this process. I don't remember who it was, but somebody did. And I would refer them to page 568, where the section 424 for worker transition is. I'd encourage you to read it fully, because all we can read is to be supplied.
I thank the gentleman very much, and we thank all of you for your testimony, and we would like to stay in close working cooperation with you in the next month or so. Thank you.
right, so